Hey guys, it's Leaf here. So Path of Exile 2 has now launched into early access, and you can finally get your hands on the game for a small fee of $30 US. But worry not, for while the early access may require you to purchase a supporter pack, the game will transition into the free-to-play model once the game fully launches, whenever that may be. And if you're curious about the time frame for the release, Grinding Gear Games stated on their website under the frequently asked questions section that the early access will last for as long as they need, but the good news is they're expecting a time frame of just 6 months. Now, I got to play Path of Exile 2 through an early demo version provided by GGG, but keep in mind that this is not sponsored content, nor is this a full review. This is simply my first impressions, giving my thoughts on the game, and if it's actually even worth it to get into the early access when the game will eventually be free anyway in the near future. I'd also like to add that the demo version is separate from the live version, so people who got to play the game earlier than you will not be able to bring their progress to the main game. That said, I played around 30 hours of this game in a span of 4 days, and unlike the others who reach max level within that time frame, I only managed to finish Act 3, putting me at, I guess, the casual spectrum of Path of Exile gamers. So while my opinions may be less significant for the hardcore player base, I think I can at least present my experience and thoughts on Path of Exile 2 for my fellow casuals. So first things first, I think it's best to start this first impressions by discussing the theme of the game. As you may know, themes are a very important aspect of video games, and it may as well be the main persuading factor in what demographic plays a certain game. Path of Exile 2, much like a lot of other ARPGs, is set in a grimdark fantasy world filled with a lot of violence, death, and a whole lot of gore. Right from the character selection screen, the game immediately shows that it is not messing around. From there, the game just goes deeper into the brutality of things with visuals that are infinitely more graphic than in Path of Exile 1. PoE 2 just goes all in without pulling any punches, showcasing how depraved and wicked the world of Wraeclast truly is. Path of Exile 2 is a game that's less about good and evil and more about the raw human instinct of survival and a lot of carnage. The dark themes of Path of Exile 2 will undoubtedly be off-putting to some, but it oozes with this sincerity that a lot of recent games lack, and I just can't help myself to not appreciate it. But how is the theme even relevant to the gameplay? Well, the overall feel of the game is generally dictated by its theme. All of the enemies, the bosses, the story, and the characters all fit into this very specific concept that would then be directly translated to the gameplay. And Path of Exile 2 is not just brutal in terms of aesthetic, but in gameplay as well. This game is hard. You will have to respawn and retry bosses or even entire sections all the time, but it also gives the game this charm that's been lost to recent video games, and that's a deep sense of accomplishment when finally beating a level that once seemed insurmountable. But more on that later, because first we need to understand what Path of Exile 2 truly is, because it is definitely not your standard ARPG, and by ARPG, I'm specifically referring to the top-down or isometric hack-and-slash games, much like something that you'd be seeing here. There have been a lot of ARPGs in the past, and while they might differ slightly in gameplay and aesthetic, their core gameplay remains exactly the same all across the genre. The establishment of these core gameplay mechanics can be traced back to the very first Diablo game from Blizzard. Since then, it hasn't really changed much, and ARPGs have since felt like reskins of each other. Path of Exile 2, however, branches off from this core ARPG experience by adding one simple yet genre-redefining feature, the dodge roll. Some of you would have probably scoffed at that, thinking that a dodge button doesn't really add anything to an ARPG. Normally, you'd be right. There are ARPGs of recent years that added a dodge feature to their game, but I never really felt the need to make use of it. Unlike in games like Dark Souls or Elden Ring where dodging is an actual core feature. But that's exactly what Path of Exile 2 has done here. It adjusted Path of Exile's entire core gameplay and balanced it to be tailored fit into this one simple system. Path of Exile 2's overall game speed is also significantly slower compared to Path of Exile 1 to better accommodate these moment-to-moment battles. Even animations have been slightly drawn out, mimicking animation locks from the Souls-like games. Essentially, Essentially, Path of Exile 2 is an ARPG amalgamated with concepts and design philosophies of the Souls-like genre, so it perfectly makes sense to call this game the Dark Souls of ARPGs because it actively derives its gameplay from Souls-likes, but not just the mechanics, mind you, the difficulty too. Which then leads me to boss encounters. Boss battles in this game are absolutely wild, with encounters ranging from "was that a boss?" to ones that drove me to the brink of insanity. Much like Souls-likes, Path of Exile 2 is a boss hunting game, having dozens of bosses scattered around the world between the game's different acts. They act as these checkpoints of progress that are kind of like rites of passages, the proof that you have reached a level worthy of going to the next stage. Because you can't just skip these bosses, you really have to slay all of them, even the repeatable ones, if you want to have even a minuscule chance to beat the final boss of the act. This isn't your run-of-the-mill power fantasy ARPG. It is a power fantasy ARPG that will challenge your skills, wisdom, and patience. Speaking of skills, Path of Exile 2 forgoes the skill system of Path of Exile 1, where the skill slots used to be tied to armor and weapons. They did this in favor of a more streamlined user interface for learning and slotting in new abilities. Skill gems still exist, but in the form of these colorless gems that you can then convert into a specific skill before equipping them to make use of in combat. These skill gems also have tiers, with the higher ones letting you either upgrade your existing skills for them to get stronger, or unlock newer skills only available at certain tier stages. Support gems also get the same treatment, now being slotted directly to a skill rather than through your gear. The downside to this one is that you can't apply a single support gem to multiple skill gems unlike in Path of Exile 1. And I honestly have mixed feelings with this new system because Path of Exile 1's gear and skill system was actually pretty fresh and unique for the genre, and now Path of Exile 2 just feels rather generic in that department. But there are a lot of skills to choose from, and theory crafting is still pretty fun in Path of Exile 2. It's just that the viability of mixing skills from different classes isn't as impactful compared to Path of Exile 1, which is fine, I guess, but I'd like to see these skills have some proper synergy at least, because as of right now, I sincerely think that there's absolutely no point in speccing skills from other classes when you'll probably be left with a pure skill set anyway, but that's just me. I haven't really played through the high level content, so it might make sense later down the line. I don't know. If you're familiar with this, do let me know in the comments. Another very important thing to discuss when talking about Path of Exile is the passive skill tree, a feature that made Path of Exile 1 the most notorious ARPG in virtue of being overly complicated. But this take is unfounded because while the entire tree definitely looks daunting, actually slotting in the points makes you realize how simple it truly is. It's really not that hard, and it's exactly the same in Path of Exile 2, only this time you can freely respec passive points by spending a little bit of gold. Speaking of gold, Path of Exile 2 now also has gold as its main currency. As for the legacy currency items, they're still around, but I'm unsure what we can do with them aside from their intended and advertised purpose. Because back in Path of Exile 1, aside from their primary effects, you can also sell specific combinations to the merchants to craft certain gears and items. I haven't seen any of that in Path of Exile 2 though, at least not in the main story stages. Lastly, I'd like to talk about the game's exploration. Path of Exile 2 is massive, and I can't stress this enough. At the early stages of the game, you'll be strolling about fairly small maps, but the further you are into the game, they just get exponentially larger. Even the labyrinths in this game are huge. I've played a lot of ARPGs, and exploration in those games have actually been quite the pleasant experience. Therapeutic, actually. But I'm afraid that the same can't be said with Path of Exile 2. Some levels are just simply excruciating to explore. It also doesn't help that the seed constantly changes and the orientation of the map keeps rotating for no good reason, so you can't even memorize specific locations. I mean, you can, but you'd essentially have to explore it again just to set your bearings right, but that I guess, is my only real complaint about this game. The exploration in this game can honestly be significantly improved, because this is just not it. But yeah, that about covers my first impressions for Path of Exile 2. Unfortunately, I ran out of time and I couldn't play through the game's high-level content. At level 40, I only managed to scratch the surface of the Ascension Trials, which is a small roguelike for the Ascension tree, and the Temple of Chaos, which is a wave-based survival mode, but I couldn't even clear that. So I guess the ultimate question boils down to, is Path of Exile 2 Early Access worth buying? That's 100% yes. While the game is admittedly hard, it is also really good. While I lag behind the community in terms of leveling, I still enjoyed all 3 acts of the game. I didn't really touch upon the story, but there is a deep lore to be found in Path of Exile 2. I just didn't really pay attention to it because, well, at the end of the day, it is still an ARPG. Path of Exile 2 in Early Access doesn't feel like an Early Access title with how polished the gameplay experience is. The game is also jam-packed with an insane amount of content, and if you want to take a sneak peek with what the Early Access has to offer, I suggest that you watch GGG's endgame presentation for Path of Exile 2, which is an entire hour-long video of just combing through everything that the Early Access has to offer. And all that for just $30 is definitely a game worth spending money on. If there's any of you who are interested in us making more content for Path of Exile 2, make sure to leave a like and maybe we can do a full early access review or maybe some guides in the future. If you have any thoughts about the video or the game, you can let us know your thoughts down in the comments. And of course, feel free to join our community by visiting the website, joining our Discord, or even just hitting that subscribe button for more gaming news and reviews. This has been Leaf, and I'll see you guys on the next one.